What's up, guys? Welcome back to Sonic Academy. My name's Nate from Protoculture and Shadow Chronicles. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about how to invest in your studio. So I wanted to do a little opinion piece and offer up some practical advice, which was kind of inspired by a few conversations I've had recently on various forums. In two particular cases, I had a chat to two people who were asking advice on how to upgrade their audio interface from an interface which I felt was perfectly fine to begin with. Now, that's not to say that having a good audio interface is a complete waste of money, but the point that I raised was that the benefits that you get from something like that are fairly minor, especially considering that you haven't ticked a few other boxes and made some other important purchases in your studio beforehand. And now, don't get me wrong, I'm in the same boat as most of you, and I'm always pining after that next fancy shiny piece of kit that's covered in LEDs. But I wanted to just offer up some food for thought as to certain areas that you should be looking at first before you go and drop your life savings on a bunch of synths and fancy audio interfaces. Let's check this out. So in my opinion, the number one place that you should be addressing first, before anything else, is your room. It's one of the least exciting upgrades you're probably going to make. In some cases, it can be pretty expensive if you go the sort of commercial acoustics route. And it's quite hard to get right at the best of times as well, but it's absolutely essential at the same time. If you think about it logically, you can spend tens of thousands of dollars on a set of reference monitors, but no matter how good those speakers are, they're only going to be as good as the room that you place them in. Now, I realize that not everybody has a permanent or ideal space, and installing a large amount of acoustic material isn't always the most practical or easiest thing to do. But I do believe at very least you should be looking at some form of broadband absorption for your space that you're working in. So without getting into too much of the science behind acoustics, let's check out a few options that you can look at. So bass traps and absorption with more volume is something that you want to really consider. Low frequency response absorption is going to help you out a massive amount in your studio. Typically, the low end is really where a lot of the problems that people have in small spaces, particularly standing waves and such. So you want to try and avoid purchasing foam panels. They can help to an extent with sort of more high frequency reflections, but you really want to be looking at, if you do have to go down the foam route, looking at getting some more higher volume bass traps or corner traps. There are some companies out there like Acoustic that have some great products. They can be on the expensive side. For me, living in South Africa, they're a bit hard to get hold of. So another great option that you can look at, quite practical and also one of the cheaper options, is going down the mineral fiber route. I use this quite extensively in my studio. The panels you see behind me, I'll just show you up close. So these panels are made from a rigid mineral fiber board. They're covered in a acoustic fabric on the back, you can see there, and then they're placed in a frame with an air gap at the back. The air gap actually helps to an extent extend the frequency response of these boards, so you'll trap a little bit more low-end stuff with that air gap. You want to kind of have high volume and a large space for that waveform to travel through, and that's really going to solve a lot of issues for you in your studio. These boards can be hung on the wall pretty easily, and they don't leave a whole lot of mess on the wall should you need to be moving rooms. If it's not a permanent room that you're working in, they can be transported quite easily and adapted to pretty much any space without too much hassle. So getting a room perfect is nigh impossible, but and can be extremely expensive at the best of times. But just covering some of these bases, at the very least, as I mentioned, is going to give you much more noticeable results than any other purchase that you're going to make for your studio. So the second area that absolutely warrants you spending more funds on is your monitors. It's the most important tool outside of your ears as a producer. And personally, if you're serious about production, I'd invest more in this from the onset. So I use a pair of Genelec 8040As. They're not insanely expensive, but they're not cheap by any measure either. That said, these monitors are now 18 years old. I've never had a problem with them. They've never let me down. I did replace a transformer in one of them recently, but at a fairly minimal cost. So if you consider the money that I spent on them at the time, as well as the amount of time that I've used these speakers for, the returns on this investment have been pretty much astronomical for me. It also has the added benefit of getting to know your monitors really well. If you have something that you've invested in that you intend keeping for a long time, getting to know those speakers is really beneficial when it comes down to your mix downs. You just know them really well. Even mixing on really great monitors, it does take time to get to understand, what's coming out of them. So having something that you're comfortable with and that will stay in your studio for a long time is a great investment to have. The same goes for headphones, obviously, as well. I'm not a huge fan of mixing on headphones, but my Sennheiser HD650s have served me incredibly well in this regard. Do your research, read reviews, and find out what's right for you. Although I will say that purchasing reference speakers or headphones is very much a personal thing. So try to demo them extensively beforehand, just so you're not dropping large amounts of money on something which doesn't work for you. Another great investment to consider, which ties into the acoustics as well, is a speaker tuning system. So some higher end monitors, like the SAM-enabled monitors from Genelec, they will actually ship with a calibration mic and included DSP on these speakers, which will allow the speakers to be adjusted for the room that you put them in. Other great systems that you can look at is IK Multimedia's ARC3 system, as well as SonarWorks, their newly rebranded Sound ID reference software. So this is essentially an EQ which is going to run on your outputs, and it's calibrated using a specific measurement microphone, which you use to measure impulses at various positions around your room. Once you've captured that data, the software uses that data to determine the best way to alter the output of your speakers so that the frequency response in the room that you're listening to is as flat and accurate as possible. So you can see it particularly beneficial if you're in a less than ideal room to have this system on hand to kind of just solve some of the other issues that you may not be able to fix with acoustics. Now, some of you may disagree with me here and find this a bit of a strange place to be placing such a high priority on, especially since it doesn't affect the audio in your studio per se. But for me personally, it's an incredibly important aspect to be looking at investing in comfort in your studio space. I honestly believe the way that you perceive audio is often very much affected by your surroundings. Good example, turning off the lights when you're listening to a mix can sort of drastically change the way that you hear your mix down. And the same goes for being comfortable. Not having to worry about being comfortable in your studio space makes it a lot easier to focus on what you're doing and kind of not be distracted in any way at all. Quite honestly, one of my most prized possessions in the studio is this guy right here. It's a Herman Miller Aeron chair, which I spent quite a bit of money on, but when you consider that I sit in this chair for anywhere between 10 and 15 hours a day, it's a massively important investment that I made in the studio. You're going to be spending long hours in front of your DAW, and being comfortable really just, like I said, it helps you just focus on the task at hand and doesn't interfere with your workflow at all. Things like lighting as well can go quite a long way to just getting you into that sort of creative mindset. Other quality of life purchases that I find quite important for me, my displays, for example. So I have a triple monitor setup, which may not be for everyone, but I love having a good quality monitor in front of me and having that screen real estate that I can see everything at the same time without having to fiddle with switching between windows and so on. Any sort of workflow and quality of life additions to the studio for me, I find very, very valuable. Cool. So what about the rest of the gear in your studio? Well, there's a few other investments which I do feel are great, and we'll just mention briefly. Obviously, your computer is a major component in the studio, and you can't go wrong with upgrading that. That said, I see a lot of folks falling into the trap of just maxing out CPUs, GPUs, and RAM. RAM is going to help you to an extent, but I think anything in excess of sort of 16 and 32 gigs is you kind of not going to be really getting major returns from that. CPUs go up exponentially when you get to the top tier of those processors. And unless you're doing loads of video editing or sort of trying to build a graphics workstation, you're not really going to see massive improvements in your DAW beyond a certain point. So one area that has made a massive difference for me personally is investing in SSD drives. It's going to enable you to have larger track counts, load times are going to be quicker, sampled instruments are going to load better. My entire instrument library, my samples, my system drive, and all my projects are housed on M.2 drives, which are incredibly quick, and they make a massive difference. So the sort of money to benefits ratio for SSD drives for me were much higher than any other components that I have in my computer setup. So coming back to the audio interfaces thing again, it can be beneficial to upgrade in this department as well. But again, don't get caught up with spending massive amounts of money on insanely high sample rates and, you know, in ridiculous amounts of preamps and so forth, unless you actually have a real need to do so. A lot of the benefits that you get from that is when you are recording a lot of stuff with microphones or acoustic instruments and so forth, then you kind of want that extra detail in the converters. That's not to say that you won't get a bit of detail from spending money on better output converters on your audio interface, but the changes are going to be pretty minimal compared to some of the other changes that we've been talking about. What I value a lot more in a audio interface is having solid drivers, especially, you know, somebody like me that's doing predominantly in the box electronic music production. Having drivers that are fast and work well, that's way more beneficial. It's part of the reason why I'm still on my old Steinberg UR28M sound card. It's a very run-of-the-mill, it's Yamaha hardware, so it's pretty decent converters, but the drivers are rock solid when it comes to Cubase, which is what I do most of my work in. Most of the mid-tier audio interfaces around nowadays are going to be just fine for you. There may be some cases where you want to upgrade for, let's say, normal outputs. For example, if you want to integrate a audio interface with a modular system, that's a valid reason to upgrade the sound card. But don't think that you're going to be getting major differences in your audio in the studio by spending tons of money on these pro interfaces. So just to close off, none of this is to say that it's a total waste of money spending on other areas. I think anything that inspires you to create music is worth the money, be that a synthesizer, a controller, what have you. Anything that sort of improves your workflow, I think has a lot of value to it. But hopefully some of these tips that I've discussed will give you a little bit more direction as to what you should be looking at first before you start sinking cash into all those other bits of gear. So what's your favorite investment that you've made in your studio? Leave us a comment below and we'll discuss. Otherwise, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video and maybe some of you found it useful. I will catch you guys soon right here at Sonic Academy. Cheers.
Thanks everyone for watching. We really appreciate the support from you guys. If you liked this video, then, you know, smash that like button. And if you want to be notified about new content, hit the subscribe and the bell notifications. Peace!